Welcome back, everyone. Today's deep dive is, feels kind of poignant. We're going to be looking at Jimmy Carter's presidency. And with his recent passing at 100, it just feels like the right time.
Definitely a moment to reflect.
You sent over some fascinating articles and excerpts. And get this, they're all in Portuguese.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we'll be exploring Carter's legacy, but through a Brazilian lens. Should bring a really unique perspective to our conversation.
I'm really interested to hear how another country, especially one with such a complex relationship with the U.S. at the time, viewed his presidency.
For sure. It's a whole different viewpoint. And we got some big questions to tackle, like why couldn't Carter secure a second term, even with all his accomplishments?
Right.
And how did the international challenges he faced, shape his decisions and ultimately his image?
Yeah, those are really at the heart of it.
And then there's this, this intriguing connection between a Brazilian fashion designer's son and U.S.-Brazil relations during Carter's time. It's a story I can't wait to get into.
That's a new one for me. I'm curious about that.
So, jumping right in, our sources really zeroed in on 1979. Seems it was a pivotal year for Carter. A year where, everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
It definitely was a turning point.
Yeah.
Several major crises, one after the other, created this perception of weakness and incompetence, you could say.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the events themselves, but how they played out in the eyes of the American public and, of course, the world.
Exactly. Perception is everything, especially in politics.
Right. So let's start with what's probably the most well-known event, the Iranian Revolution and that hostage crisis that followed. Imagine, Americans held hostage for 444 days. That had to be a massive blow to Carter's image.
Absolutely. It became a symbol of American vulnerability. Here's the thing. This was the Cold War. Tensions with the Soviet Union were at their peak. Any sign of weakness, any at all, could be exploited.
And then that failed rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw.
Oh, that was just devastating. Logistical problems, a tragic accident in the Iranian desert, American servicemen losing their lives. It just solidified this image of a presidency that was, struggling to protect its own citizens.
Yeah, it's hard to grasp the impact of that, how it must have shaped Americans' views of their place in the world, almost like a loss of national confidence.
It definitely did for many. This feeling of unease, it was compounded by the economic woes at home. Stagflation was crippling the American economy. High inflation, high unemployment. Yeah. A really tough combination.
Stagflation. It's not just some dry economic term, is it? It represents real hardship. Everyday people struggling to make ends meet.
Exactly. And Carter's policies, while aimed at tackling these issues, weren't always seen in a positive light. His emphasis on energy conservation, remember the Wear a Sweater campaign?
Oh, yeah.
Well, some saw it as out of touch, not really addressing the economic anxieties people were actually facing.
Interesting, isn't it? The messaging behind that campaign. Was it purely about conserving energy, or was there a deeper message there, trying to shift American attitudes towards consumption, maybe?
That's a good point. It could have been both, right? On one hand, reduce dependence on foreign oil. On the other, maybe promote a more sustainable lifestyle, something that wasn't exactly mainstream at the time.
Right. And the Federal Reserve, what about their role in all of this? Weren't they trying to control inflation with their policies?
Yes, but their restrictive monetary policies, while intended to curb inflation, also unfortunately increased unemployment. It's this classic economic dilemma. How do you address one problem without making the other worse?
So Carter was, caught between a rock and a hard place. And this economic discontent, ultimately it opened the door for Ronald Reagan. He offered that more optimistic vision for the future, right?
Exactly. Carter was focused on the immediate crises. Reagan tapped into this sense of national malaise and offered hope, a sense of renewal.
And all this while he was dealing with these complex international relations. Which brings us to that story from Brazil. This case with the fashion designer's son. It really highlights that tension between Carter's focus on human rights and the realities of Cold War politics.
It does. It's a window into how those priorities, sometimes competing priorities, played out on a personal level with real consequences.
So the case, for those who haven't heard it, involves the son of Brazilian fashion designer Zuzu Angel. He disappeared, detained by the Brazilian military regime. For Carter, this wasn't just some abstract political issue, it was a human tragedy.
And it put him in a tough spot. Committed to promoting human rights globally, but also dealing with the Cold War. Brazil was a key ally in Latin America. How hard could he push without risking that alliance?
A question that resonates even today, doesn't it? Balancing U.S. values with strategic interests, especially when dealing with countries that, well, don't always share those values.
A perennial challenge. No easy answers. But in Carter's case, his pressure on Brazil did have repercussions.
You're referring to President 𝗖𝗃𝗍𝗃 breaking off that U.S.-Brazil military agreement.
Exactly. A bold move by 𝗖𝗃𝗍𝗃. It showed the limits of Carter's influence. Some criticized him for interfering. Others felt he wasn't doing enough for human rights. It was a no-win situation.
So did his human rights diplomacy work in Brazil? Or did it backfire?
Tough to measure the direct impact. What we do know is that Zuzu Angel's son's case brought international attention to the abuses happening in Brazil. It pressured the regime and fueled that growing movement for democracy and human rights within the country.
It shows that international pressure can have an effect on domestic politics, even if the results aren't immediate or crystal clear.
Absolutely. It also highlights the tough choices leaders face when trying to balance all these different priorities on the global stage.
So we've seen how 1979 was this year of, well, extraordinary challenges for Carter, both at home and abroad. But despite all those setbacks, he also accomplished some amazing things in foreign policy. Things often forgotten because of those crises. Normalizing relations with China. Talk about a geopolitical game changer.
It really was a move that acquired incredible foresight, and a willingness to break from decades of Cold War policy.
Let's explore that a bit. What was the thinking, the strategy behind Carter's decision to formally recognize the People's Republic of China? What was he hoping to achieve?
Well, he saw this growing rift between China and the Soviet Union, a chance to exploit it. By establishing diplomatic relations with Beijing, he was essentially driving a wedge between them. The goal: weaken the Soviet Union's influence on the world stage.
So, a long game strategy, recognizing that a strong relationship with China could reshape the global balance of power.
And it was a gamble, but one that ultimately paid off. The Sino-Soviet split became a defining feature of the late Cold War, and China's economic and military rise in the decades since, you can trace that back to those initial steps Carter took.
It's incredible to think about, isn't it? The long-term impact of that decision, setting in motion events that reshape the geopolitical landscape for decades to come.
It speaks to his strategic thinking, his willingness to challenge the status quo, even when facing opposition, both at home and internationally.
And then there's another major foreign policy achievement, the Camp David Accords and the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. He brought these two long-standing adversaries together, accomplished what many thought was impossible.
It was remarkable. He personally invested so much time and effort, brought Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin to the table, and his persistence paid off.
And this wasn't just symbolic, was it? It had real consequences for the region.
Absolutely. The peace between Egypt and Israel has lasted for over 4 decades. A cornerstone of stability in the Middle East, despite all the conflicts and tensions.
So a more nuanced picture of Carter's presidency starts to emerge. A leader battling constant crises, but also achieving some truly significant things, even if they're often overlooked.
It reminds us that history is rarely black and white. Carter's legacy, it's complex, shaped by those turbulent times he governed and the long-term effects of his decisions.
We've only scratched the surface, folks. So much more to uncover. We'll be back after a quick break to delve deeper into the lasting impacts of Carter's policies, especially those involving China and the Middle East. Stay tuned.
I can't wait.
We've been talking about these bold moves with China, the Middle East, but we can't forget the backdrop. All this happened with Cold War tensions escalating.
Right. While Carter's working towards peace in the Middle East, building that relationship with China, he's also dealing with a resurgent Soviet Union.
And 1979 was a tough year on that front, wasn't it? We talked about the Iranian Revolution, but there were other things happening that really tested Carter's leadership.
Oh, absolutely. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, December 1979, that was a major turning point. It shattered any hope of détente. That easing of tensions between the superpowers that had defined the 70s.
Yeah.
It raised serious concerns about Soviet expansionism, what it meant for global stability.
For those who might not be familiar with détente, can you explain a little more about what it meant for U.S.-Soviet relations and how it shaped Carter's approach to foreign policy, especially early on in his presidency?
Sure. Détente was this period of, increased cooperation, communication between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Things like arms control agreements, SALT II comes to mind, cultural exchanges, even joint scientific projects. It was recognizing that, look, despite our ideological differences, we had to cooperate, prevent nuclear war, manage global challenges together. And Carter, initially, he embraced détente, wanted to build on the progress made by previous administrations.
So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it really threw a wrench in those plans. How did Carter react to this act of aggression?
He took a multi-pronged approach, I guess you could say. Condemnation combined with concrete actions. He condemned the invasion on moral grounds, obviously, violated international law, Afghanistan's sovereignty, but he also imposed economic sanctions on the Soviet Union, a grain embargo, for one, and then pulling the U.S. out of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, a symbolic gesture but a powerful one, showing American displeasure.
Yeah, that Olympic boycott was huge. I remember it being all over the news, a real sign of how bad things had gotten between the two countries. But did those actions actually deter the Soviets?
They definitely showed American resolve, but they didn't change the situation in Afghanistan. The invasion dragged on for years, this proxy war between the superpowers, a humanitarian disaster for the Afghan people. And it fueled those Cold War anxieties, added to this growing perception of Carter as a weak leader, indecisive.
It's like he was walking a tightrope, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Trying to stand up to the Soviets but avoid a direct military confrontation that could escalate into something much bigger.
Exactly. It was a delicate balance. And he got criticized from both sides. Too soft on the Soviets, some said. Too confrontational, others said.
All while the Iranian hostage crisis was still going on. Adding to this feeling of crisis, the world spinning out of control.
It was a perfect storm of crises, each one feeding into the others. An overwhelming challenge for the Carter administration.
And then there was another event in '79, closer to home this time, that tested Carter's foreign policy. The Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua, right in America's backyard. The overthrow of a U.S.-backed dictator.
The Sandinista National Liberation Front, a leftist revolutionary group, they overthrew the Somoza regime. It had been in power for decades, corrupt, repressive, a significant blow to U.S. influence in Central America.
It must have been a tricky situation for Carter, a champion of human rights, but supporting a dictator like Somoza, it just wouldn't align with his principles.
It was a real dilemma for him. Ideologically opposed to supporting authoritarian regimes, but also concerned about the Sandinistas' leftist leanings, the potential for Soviet influence in the region.
So how did he handle that? What was his approach to Nicaragua?
He ended up cutting off aid to Somoza, showed his disapproval of the regime's human rights abuses, but he didn't fully embrace the Sandinistas either, wary of their potential alignment with Cuba, the Soviet Union.
Was that hands-off approach effective? Did it influence the outcome of the revolution?
Hard to say for sure. Some argue that a more decisive intervention could have prevented the Sandinista victory. Others say it was inevitable given the opposition to Somoza. What's clear is that it fed into that narrative of American decline. Carter's inability to control events, even in its own hemisphere.
So by the end of 1979, Carter's facing multiple foreign policy crises, a struggling economy at home, and this perception of weakness, ineffectiveness. It's hard to imagine facing that kind of pressure.
It was an incredibly difficult period for any president, and we have to remember these events weren't happening in isolation. They were all interconnected, influencing each other. A complex and volatile global landscape.
So how did Carter respond to this perfect storm of challenges? Did he change his approach to foreign policy? Double down on his existing strategies?
He did a bit of both, actually. In some areas, he doubled down on human rights and diplomacy. In others, he took a more assertive stance, especially with the Soviet Union. For example, in 1980, he announced the Carter Doctrine, declared the Persian Gulf of vital U.S. interest, pledged to use military force if necessary to defend it against Soviet encroachment.
That was a big shift, wasn't it? Moving away from détente and towards a more confrontational approach to the Soviet Union.
It was. The Carter Doctrine acknowledged that the U.S. needed to project strength, deter Soviet aggression, especially in strategically important regions like the Persian Gulf. And it paved the way for a larger U.S. military presence in the region, a legacy that still shapes American foreign policy today.
So while dealing with all these immediate crises, he's also making decisions with long-term consequences.
Absolutely. His actions regarding China, the Middle East, the Soviet Union, they set the stage for many of the geopolitical dynamics that played out in the following decades.
And even with that perception of weakness, he achieved some real successes in foreign policy. We talked about the China normalization, the Camp David Accords. I think it's worth revisiting them, exploring their lasting impact.
I agree. They show that even amidst all those crises and setbacks, Carter was capable of strategic thinking, bold action, actions that had a real impact on the world stage.
Let's start with China. What were the long-term implications of that decision to normalize relations with Beijing? How did it reshape the global balance of power?
It's hard to overstate the significance of that decision. Formally recognizing the People's Republic of China, embracing the One China policy, it ended decades of U.S. isolation of China, opened the door for economic and diplomatic engagement.
And it was a gamble, wasn't it? Breaking with the long-standing policy of supporting Taiwan, risking alienating a key ally in the region.
A big risk. But Carter believed it was necessary. To counter Soviet influence, engage China as a rising power. And it paid off. China's economic opening, integration into the global economy. You can trace it back to those steps Carter took.
This is playing the long game, seeing the strategic and economic benefits of a strong relationship with China.
He understood that China's growing power would reshape the world. Engaging with them early on, he hoped to shape that process in a way that benefited U.S. interests.
But it wasn't just about the Soviet Union, right? There were economic factors, too.
Of course. Carter saw China's economic potential, the opportunity for expanded trade and investment, part of a broader shift in U.S. foreign policy, a more economically driven approach, recognizing the importance of global trade.
And what about the Camp David Accords? How did they shape the Middle East?
The Camp David Accords are one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of the 20th century. They ended the state of war between Egypt and Israel, laid the groundwork for a lasting peace.
Not just symbolic, though, right? Tangible effects on the ground.
Definitely. The peace treaty led to the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, diplomatic relations established between the two countries. It even created a framework for future negotiations on the Palestinian issue, although those have been much more challenging.
So, while the Accords didn't solve everything in the Middle East, they were a major breakthrough, a testament to Carter's commitment to peace.
And their impact has been lasting. Peace between Egypt and Israel for over 4 decades, even amidst all the ongoing conflicts. It shows the power of diplomacy, the importance of personal relationships in international relations.
We're starting to see a fuller picture of Carter's foreign policy. Complex, multifaceted, marked by successes and setbacks, foresight and unforeseen consequences.
It reminds us that history is rarely a simple narrative. It's about understanding those complexities, the unintended consequences, the lasting impact of choices made in challenging times.
We spent this deep dive really digging into Jimmy Carter's presidency, a time of, well, amazing achievements, but also some really tough challenges. As we wrap up, I'd love to hear more about the long-term impacts of his policies. We touched on them, but there's just so much to unpack, especially when it comes to China and the Middle East.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How those decisions made back then, they still resonate today, often in ways they probably never could have predicted.
Let's start with China. Normalizing those relations with Beijing, it was a bold move, no doubt about it, and it's had such a huge impact on the world. How do you see that decision shaping the geopolitics we see playing out today?
Well, establishing those diplomatic relations with China, it was a game changer, absolutely. It changed the Cold War balance of power, weakened the Soviet Union, contributed to its eventual collapse, but it also set the stage for China's economic rise, turning it into, well, the global powerhouse it is now.
It's almost like he saw the future.
Yeah.
Recognized China's potential, even when it wasn't so obvious.
He definitely had incredible foresight, and it wasn't a simple decision either. Embracing that One China policy, it meant dealing with that tricky relationship with Taiwan, a balancing act that's still going on.
And with China's economic rise, there have been new challenges too. Human rights concerns, their military power growing, their more assertive stance globally. These are the issues that dominate U.S.-China relations today.
Definitely. It's a complicated relationship, full of opportunities and challenges, of course, but it all goes back to those decisions made by Carter and his administration.
It makes you think, what if he hadn't taken that step? Would China still have become a global power? Or did Carter's recognition kind of accelerate that process?
That's the question, isn't it? Historians will probably debate that for years to come. Impossible to know for sure what would happen. But we can't deny that his actions, they set things in motion, changed the course of both China and the United States.
And on that note of lasting impacts, let's move to the Middle East. The Camp David Accords, they were historic, showed Carter's commitment to diplomacy, to peace. But even with that breakthrough, the region still struggles with conflict and instability. What are your thoughts on the legacy of the Accords? How have they shaped the Middle East in the decades since?
The Camp David Accords definitely had a positive impact. The peace between Egypt and Israel over 40 years now, that's remarkable, especially considering their history, the conflicts in the region. It really shows the power of diplomacy, the importance of, well, those personal relationships and international relations.
But they didn't solve everything, right?
Right.
The Palestinian issue, for example, that's still a major source of tension.
Yeah, exactly. The accords address the conflict between Egypt and Israel, but not the broader Arab-Israeli conflict, the question of Palestinian statehood. Those are still at the heart of so much instability in the region.
And it's interesting, too, how the Carter Doctrine, which came about because of that Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, played a role in shaping the Middle East as well. It basically said the U.S. would defend its interests in the Persian Gulf, led to more military involvement in the region.
The Carter Doctrine was a big shift. Showed the U.S. was willing to use force to protect its interests in a region, well, considered vital to global stability. It also laid the groundwork for a larger U.S. military presence in the Middle East, something that's continued under every administration since.
And that presence has been controversial, of course.
Oh, definitely. It's been a source of tension, debate. Critics say it's fueled instability, contributed to anti-American sentiment.
So it seems like Carter's actions in the Middle East, the peacemaking, the military presence, they've had a deep, complex impact on the region, shaping its path in ways we're still seeing unfold today.
It's true. Foreign policy decisions, they have a ripple effect. They go far beyond a single presidency. They shape the world for generations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Jimmy Carter's presidency, what do you see as his most enduring legacy? What should we take away from exploring this time in history?
Carter's legacy is, well, it's complicated, full of nuance. He was a president who faced incredible challenges domestically and internationally. He made mistakes, but he also achieved some truly amazing things. He was driven by his morals, his commitment to human rights, peace, diplomacy, and everything he did, his successes, his failures, they continue to shape the world we live in today.
He wasn't easy to categorize, was he? He challenged the way things were done. And even though he only served one term, his impact, it's been profound, long-lasting.
Definitely. He wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. He went after ambitious goals, stood by his principles, even when it meant facing criticism, setbacks.
He left behind this complex legacy that people are still debating, analyzing, and that's what makes him so fascinating. There's always something more to discover, to understand.
It's been great to explore this with you. I hope our listeners have gained a deeper appreciation for Jimmy Carter, a man who, despite everything, really left his mark on history.
Well said. And to our listeners, if this has sparked your interest, keep exploring. Read what Carter wrote himself. Dig into the historical accounts. Form your own conclusions. There's so much information out there. And by learning, by exploring, we can really start to understand the complexities of history and the leaders who shaped it. Until next time, keep diving deep.